The dative case is a grammatical case that typically marks the indirect object of a verb. The indirect object is a noun in the clause that is indirectly affected by the action of the verb. Modern English does not have a dative case marker. Instead, the indirect object is usually indicated by either a prepositional phrase or word order. Besides indicating the indirect object of the verb, the dative case can also perform the task of a preposition. In other words, it can express the relationship between two nouns with words such as to, for, against, with, by, etc. In the following examples, you'll see the same Greek word translated 3 different ways. Now let's set up our visual filter to highlight the words that are in the dative case. Let's go to File, then Visual Filter. We want to make sure we have Morph selected because we're looking at forms of words. And let's name this Greek dative case VF for visual filter. And we want our range to be all passages. And for resources, since we'll be in the ESV, let's type in ESV. And since we're working with the New Testament, we want to choose Logos Greek Morphology. Let's type in an @ symbol and select the article and dative. And let's select the color blue. Type in the @ symbol again, select adjective and dative case. And again the color blue. The @ symbol and select noun for part of speech. Dative under case. And blue again. And lastly, we'll pick the pronoun. Dative. Participle also uses the dative case, but we're not going to worry about that at this moment. Now let's go to the command bar to open up a Bible. Type in the words ESV and click on English Standard Version. And okay, it looks like our visual filter worked. We're all set to go. Luke 7:2 reads, "Now a centurion had a servant who was sick and at the point of death, who was highly valued by him." Here's the first illustration where a word in the dative case can perform the task of a preposition. Take a look at the word that's highlighted here, him. And if we look at the underlying Greek word, we see that that is auto, which is translated him. And to the left of this word, we see a preposition, an English preposition, by, but it doesn't have any information underneath it. This English word is supplied by translators to help flesh out the meaning of this Greek word here, which is in the dative case. But you'll see in the next couple illustrations that by isn't the only English word supplied for this Greek word, auto. Keep in mind that when translators supply words, it's not just because of this one word here. It's because of the other words that this word is in relationship with in the sentence or clause. Now here's the next illustration from Luke 9:52. "And he sent messengers ahead of him, who went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him." And in this verse, in the reverse interlinear pane, we can see that the same Greek word is used here as was in our last verse, auto. And here it has the same English translation before, him. But notice that to the left it has a different preposition here in English. Instead of by, it has for. And so even though this word is in the dative case, and even though it functions as an indirect object, when it's in relationship with these other words, a different preposition is used to express its meaning. Let's go on to one more illustration. This illustration is just a few verses after our previous one, Luke 9:58, which reads, "And Jesus said to him, 'Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head.'" Now in this verse, we have a word highlighted here, him. It's highlighted because the underlying Greek word is in the dative case, And that word is the same word that we've seen in our other illustrations, auto, which is translated him, but you'll notice to the left of it is yet a different English preposition here. And as in the previous illustrations, this word auto, which is translated him, is functioning as the indirect object in the clause. Same word, same case, and even the same function, but in each illustration, a different English preposition is supplied. So you see that even a literal translation like the ESV needs to supply words. This isn't wrong, this just goes to show you that Greek is not English. There are differences in how each language goes about communicating the same idea. Greek can use the dative case, English uses prepositions. And so the dative is often, but not always, translated with an English preposition, like in, with, by, for, or to. Just remember the key here is context. Different context, different relationship to words, equals a different meaning.
Now, typically, in an introductory course, you learn that the dative case is the case of indirect object, and that you can translate it with keywords such as to, with, and in. Then in an intermediate course, you learn that the dative case has a wide range of uses. It can express relationships like interest, location, or means. Those types of relationships aren't determined by morphology alone, that is, by the form of the word, but by context, by the words around them. The dative case can indicate the indirect object of the verb. Verbs of giving and speaking often include an indirect object which appears in the dative case.
John 5:27 reads, "And he has given him authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man." And we have a word in English here highlighted in blue because the underlying Greek word is in the dative case. And that word is auto, which is translated him. In this clause, the word auto is the indirect object of the verb edoken, which is translated given. So here's our verb of giving that we talked about earlier, with exousion, which is translated authority, as the direct object. This specifies what was given. And you'll notice the absence of key words like in, to, or for here with this use of the dative. And the translation could go either way. It could be given him authority, as we have here in the ESV, or it could be something like given authority to him. Now we can go down here to the morphology line to look at the form of the word, that is, its part of speech and number and gender. But if we want to look at the function of the word, we want to look at a different resource, like the Cascadia syntax graphs. And this resource provides annotations for the functions of words within clauses and sentences. Here on the right we have a literal English translation along with the manuscript line in Greek over here. And notice the annotations here. The O for object, and we have edoken, translated he granted as the verb, with auto, translated him, for the indirect object. And here if you hover over it, you get a bit more of a technical definition. Now this use of the dative case functioning as indirect object is pretty common. And you'll probably be able to spot it easily enough just in an English translation, although you will have this syntax graph and the annotations here to help you. You will want to look at the significance of what is being given to whom. So for example, is there significance in authority being given to Jesus? Well, I would say yes, because in the Old Testament, there is one mysterious figure to whom authority is granted. And that mysterious figure is the Son of Man, from Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. Matthew 18:26 reads, "So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything.'" This verse is part of a parable that Jesus tells about unforgiveness, where a servant who owed his master a lot of money was forgiven his debt, but then soon after finds a fellow servant who owes him money and has him imprisoned. In this verse we have several English words highlighted because the underlying Greek words are in the dative case. We're not going to look at every one of these, just this last one. Soy, which is in the dative case, is translated you, and it's the indirect object of the verb apodoso, which is translated pay. In this clause, Panta, which is translated everything, is the direct object, specifying what was given. You can see the annotations of indirect object and direct object in two other resources. First, the Cascadia syntax graphs of the New Testament. Here, panta, which is translated everything, is labeled O for object. Apodoso is labeled verb, which is translated I will pay back. And finally, we have that pronoun, soi, which is translated you, labeled as the indirect object. It's the same in the Lexem syntactic graphs of the New Testament. Here's our word soi in the dative case, but as to its function in the clause, it's the indirect object.
The dative case can express interest, either of advantage or of disadvantage. English translations may supply words like for to indicate advantage, or the word against to indicate disadvantage.
Jude 1 reads, Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ, and brother of James, to those who are called, beloved in God the Father, and kept for Jesus Christ. This verse is part of Jude's greeting to his letter, and we'll use it as an illustration for what other uses the dative case has. You've learned the most common use, which is that of indirect object, but if you were to apply that understanding to each one of these words, here that are highlighted because the underlying Greek word is in the dative case, it wouldn't make much sense. Let's just take a look at the last few words in this verse. Jesus Christ, which are highlighted because, in the Greek, these words are in the dative case, and you can see that the ESV has supplied the English word for with this use of the dative case. Now, in other videos, we looked at two different resources that help us understand the function of words within clauses and sentences. Let's look at the Cascadia syntax graphs of the New Testament. And we can see over here that this phrase, for Jesus Christ, here, which even though it's in the dative, is not annotated as being an indirect object. That is, you would usually see in place of adv, which is adverbial function, usually you'd see indirect object. In other words, Jesus Christ isn't the indirect object in this clause. Instead, the adverbial function lets us know something more about the verb kept or preserved. Why are we kept? We're kept for Jesus Christ. Okay, so we see that the label here is an indirect object, but adverbial. What about in the other resource, SGNT, expansions and annotations? Here in this resource, the syntactic force is labeled as dative of advantage. And this use of the dative case is to show loss or gain of benefit. So right now you're seeing that the dative case has a range of uses. In this instance, you could understand this as a dative that expresses advantage. So how could you use this information or analysis in your next teaching or sermon? Well, first of all, you probably don't want to use the words syntactic force or dative of advantage, but you can talk about the implications of this annotation or analysis. For most people, they don't view themselves as a value or benefit to Jesus or maybe his kingdom. Maybe it's because of their upbringing or their social status. But here, this analysis would suggest that they are of value and they are of benefit to Jesus because they're made in his image and because they bear his image and because they're called to be his church and his children. Matthew 23:31 reads, Thus you witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murder the prophets. In this verse, Jesus points out the hypocrisy of the religious leaders, in that while they decorate the monuments of prophets who were martyred long ago, they reject God's one and only Son. Now, it's those external actions that are a witness against them. Now, in this verse, we have an English word highlighted here because the underlying Greek word, heautois, is in the dative case. And you can see that the ESV here supplies an English preposition against in order to make explicit the type of idea that is being expressed here by this dative in this context. Now, the morphology line only gives us information on the form of the word or the part of speech. We want to look at the syntactic Greek New Testament expansions and annotations to see the function or syntactic force of this word in the sentence. Here we have our word, heautois. We can see that it's in the dative case. And the syntactic force is that of advantage. That in this context, this dative expresses the show of loss or the gain of benefit. Now you'll have to be aware that in this database, the dative of advantage encompasses both loss and benefit. So in looking over passages, let context be your guide.
The dative case can indicate reference, as in with reference to. This use of the dative occurs most often with abstract nouns, nouns that cannot be perceived through the five senses. These are words like sin, love, grace, and faith, for example. This use of the dative limits or focuses the action of the verb to a specific point of reference.
Romans 6 verse 2 reads, "By no means. How can we who died to sin still live in it?" Here in this verse, Paul is making an appeal to the Romans to live a new life in light of Christ's death and resurrection. Now here we have a couple words highlighted for us because the underlying Greek words are in the dative case. Right now we're just going to look at one here, the word underneath the English sin, which is te hamartia, the Greek definite article, followed by the noun hamartia, which is translated here sin. And notice that the ESV supplies the English preposition to for this use of the dative within this context. And now we want to think a little bit more about the relationship between te hamartia, which is translated to sin, and this Greek verb apethanomen, which is translated died. Do you see how this phrase in the dative case limits the action of the verb? We didn't just die in general, or die in such a way that we don't have life. We died with respect to something. We died with respect to sin. Let's take a look at the syntactic Greek New Testament, expansions and annotations. Here's the noun that we were looking at, hamartia, which is translated sin, and it's in the dative case. And notice the syntactic force, a dative of respect. And this glossary note mentions the distinction between a dative used with respect to something and a dative used with reference to something. The reference usage being limited to a physical entity, while the usage of respect is limited to words that are abstract in sense. For example, hamartia is not a physical entity, but an abstract noun. That is, a noun that can't be perceived through one of the five senses. And so we want to ask the question now, so how could I use this in a sermon? What's the application here? Well, first of all, you don't want to use words like syntactic force or dative of respect in your sermon. But that's not to say that you can't talk about the implications of this annotation in your sermon. So, for example, many outside the church, and even within the church, would define a believer or a Christian as somebody who is dead to everything. They're dead to this, they're dead to that. Instead of defining a Christian or a believer as someone who was alive to someone. Now this annotation here, dative of respect, limits the scope of that verb, which was died. We didn't die to everything. We died with respect to one thing, sin, so that we could become alive to somebody, God. So a Christian is someone who has died with respect to sin and has become alive to God.
Location is another category of usage for the dative. This category includes subcategories such as sphere, time, and accompaniment. The dative case can indicate the location or sphere in which the action of the verb occurs. This use of the dative answers the question, where? English Bible translations may supply the word in, on, or at, depending on the context.
One of the major themes of the book of Hebrews is the supremacy of Jesus Christ. Now, Hebrews 9:24 gives a reason for the supremacy of Jesus. It reads, "For Christ has entered not into the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf." And these words over here are highlighted for us in English because the underlying Greek words are in the dative case. Those Greek words are to, prosopo. And these words are translated into English with the phrase in the presence, with this English preposition supplied here, for this use of the dative case within this context. And just by reading this in English, you can see that this dative case doesn't actually function as the indirect object of the Greek verb emphanestheni, which is translated to appear. Instead, these words in the dative case have a different function. Let's take a look at the syntax graphs. And here are the words we're looking at. Emphanestheni to prosopo. To appear in the presence. And you can see that the annotation here isn't that of indirect object, but of adverbial function. It tells us something more about the when, where, how, or why of a verbal action. In other words, where does he appear? He appears in the presence. This adverbial phrase here tells us something more about this verbal action. And we know that it answers the question where and not when because this word prosopo refers to a location and not time. We can see this a little more clearly in the syntactic Greek New Testament, expansions and annotations. And here's the Greek word we were looking at, prosopo, which is translated face or presence. With regard to form, it's in the dative case, but in this context, this word in this case has a syntactic force that expresses location. A dative that is used to express location is also called a locative dative. And so, application. How can you use this information in a teaching? Well, first remember, you'll want to stay away from the technical jargon while still capturing the author's main point here. It's the fact that Jesus serves in this specific location, that is, the presence of God, that makes him so superior, both his high priestly office and his sacrifice. So remember that as you work with a dative that expresses location, you want to see if there's any significance as to where the action of the verb takes place. James exhorts believers not to discriminate against others on the basis of wealth or social status. And here in verse 5 of chapter 2, he writes, "Listen, my beloved brothers. Has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he has promised to those who love him?" And our visual filter has highlighted several words in this verse because the underlying Greek words are in the dative case. And we want to take a closer look at this phrase here, the world, which is translated from to cosmo. Both the definite article and the noun are in the dative case. And you can see that the ESV has supplied the English preposition in to help express the idea behind this Greek word, in this case, in this context. Now, because this Greek word cosmo refers to a location, and because it's in the dative case, scholars label this use the dative of location, or locative dative. And if we look at the syntactic Greek New Testament, expansions and annotations, we see that that's the label for syntactic force that this word's been given.
The dative case can indicate time, typically a point in time rather than a duration of time. This use of the dative case answers the question when. English Bible translations may supply the word in, on, or at, depending on the context.
Matthew 12:10 reads, "And a man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, 'Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?' so that they might accuse him." And so the religious leaders ask him this question. Now you'll see there's a word here highlighted for us in English because the underlying Greek word, tois sabasin, is in the dative case, both the article and the noun. And, as we mentioned earlier, English Bible translations like the ESV need to supply an English preposition for this use of the dative. And you can see that this dative isn't being used as the indirect object. Rather, the dative case is expressing something to do with time. And since it's not functioning as the indirect object, it's functioning adverbially. Instead, it's telling us something more about these two Greek verbs here. Exestin, which is translated it is lawful, and therapeusai, which is translated to heal. The question is, when is it lawful to heal? Now in this graph, let's see how it's annotated here for us. Here we have the phrase, on the Sabbath, tois sabasin. And we can see that it's annotated not as an indirect object, that is IO, but as having an adverbial function. That is, it tells us something more about the verbs around it. It is permitted and to heal. If we want to take a look at the specific use of this dative, we need to go to the Lexem Syntactic Greek New Testament. Expansions and annotations. And here we find our word, sabasin, which is translated Sabbath, and the dative. And the syntactic force here in this context is that of a temporal dative, or a dative that is used to express temporal aspect. Now, with this use of the dative, you're not going to find a lot of differences between most major translations. They're going to have the words on or in or something like that. But when the dative is used with reference to time, it's talking about a point in time. This is different from the genitive and the accusative cases, whereas the genitive talks about a kind of time, the accusative talks about the extent of time, the dative talks about a point in time. And that's why you have a translation like on the Sabbath rather than during the Sabbath. So how could you use this in a sermon? Well, keep in mind that the temporal dative is going to function adverbially. It's going to tell you the when or the how as to a verbal action. Here, the action of healing is limited to the Sabbath. And this becomes the main point of dispute between Jesus and the religious leaders. It doesn't seem that they were opposed to healing in general. In fact, it almost seems like they weren't even surprised that it happened. But they were taken back that it happened on the Sabbath. And so in your study, you're going to want to ask, is it significant that the verbal action is limited to this specific point in time? And in the context of Matthew 12, you'd want to do more than just look at the grammar. You'd now want to look at the word, but not a Greek lexicon. You'd want to look at an English Bible dictionary to understand the history, traditions, and laws surrounding the Sabbath, so that you can get to the point of this passage, that holiness is not about preserving traditions, but it's about preserving people. So Paul, having described the miraculous work of God in taking us from death to life, now reminds Gentile believers that they were once outsiders, but are now part of the people of God. So Paul writes this in Ephesians 2:12. Remember that you were, at that time, separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. In this verse, we have several words highlighted for us by our visual filter, because the underlying Greek words are in the dative case. Let's take a look at just these two words here, the English phrase, that time, which underneath in Greek is ekeno to kairo, with the demonstrative pronoun, the article, and the noun all in the dative case. And you'll notice that the ESV here supplies the English preposition at to express the idea of this dative in this context. And you can tell even by reading in English that these words here aren't functioning as the indirect object of this verb. They have a different function. So let's take a look at another resource. In the Cascadia syntax graphs of the New Testament, we can see that this group of words here, at time that, which is following the Greek word order here, to kairo ekeno, this group of words here are not functioning as an indirect object, which would have the annotation IO. Instead, they're functioning adverbially. The group of words is providing additional information to this Greek verb here, ete, which is translated you were. So, when were you apart from Christ? At that time, which refers back to the time prior to their conversion. Now let's see more specifically how the Greek word kairo is annotated in the syntactic Greek New Testament. And here's the noun we were just looking at, kairo, which is translated time or season. In the dative case, and we can see the syntactic force here is that of a temporal dative, a word in the dative case that is used to express temporal aspect. Keep in mind that the dative expresses a point in time. That's different from the genitive, which expresses a kind of time, and the accusative, which expresses the extent of time. So how can you use this in a sermon, or how can this type of information apply? Well, you, like Paul, could remind them of that point in time when they were alienated from Christ. Just so long as you finish with verse 13. But now, as opposed to at that time, here's a contrast. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off have been brought near through the blood of Christ. That though we were separated at one point in time, but now we have been brought so close that we're told we are in Christ Jesus.